Good morning. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Before I start sharing my slides with you, I'd like to say I'm terribly sorry that I cannot be with you synchronously online in this conference, but I'm very excited to be with you nonetheless and very thankful for the opportunity. Special thanks to Dr. Sayom Getanet and Nicole Brownlee for the invitation, and to all the organizers and all of you for taking the time to join us today. I will be sharing my screen now with you. One second, let me put it in presenter and slideshow mode, sorry. Yes, great, thank you. So my presentation is called Between Languages Beyond Borders, English as an Additional Language Learners and Equitable Online Teacher Education. The second title that you may not have seen is Language Power in the Translanguaging Space. My name is Nela Navarro. I'm from Rutgers University's Department of English with an affiliate status in the Departments of Spanish and Portuguese. I'd like to begin today the way that I try to begin most of what I do in this kind of work, with an invitation. I teach in a university where almost half of my graduate students are multilingual, and a recent survey of our university more broadly, including undergraduates, found that 70% move across 2, 3, sometimes 4 languages within the same semester, sometimes within the same sentence. Watching them engage academically and watching how the institutions around them, in this case Rutgers, responds to that work has very much shaped the way I think about teacher education to our conversation today. So here's my invitation to you. For the next 25 minutes to half an hour, I'd like to invite you as professional educators like myself, who shape future and current teachers, come to understand how future and current teachers come to understand their students, often before these very teachers ever set foot in a classroom of their own, to consider a population that is growing in nearly every context we prepare teachers for: English as an additional language learners, EAL learners. Students who bring 1, 2, sometimes 4 or 5 languages into rooms that too often only recognize one. I'll speak from my own context, the United States, but what I'm describing isn't only a US problem, and it isn't only an EAL problem. It's a broader question about language power and who gets to be seen as a learner. Let's start with some definitions. I want to pause on language itself for a moment because the terms we use already carry a theory of the student. For a long time, the dominant label in the US was ELL, LEP, Limited English Proficiency, ELL, English Language Learner, and ESL, English as a Second Language. Across much of the country, these terms are still, unfortunately, the norm. They center what a student doesn't have, quietly positioning monolingual proficiency as a goal. It's an assimilationist project. EAL, English as an Additional Language, does something I think quite different. It assumes the student already has languages, plural, and English is one more addition to that repertoire, not a replacement for what came before it. Instead of how far behind is a student, the question becomes, what does the student already know what to do with language, and how does English, or the language of your context, whatever country you're coming from, extend that? I'll use AAL throughout the talk, and I'd like to invite you to notice which terms show up in your own program syllabi and other important academic documents. ELL learners face a particularly well-documented set of challenges. I'll come back to those. But here's what I want us to understand and think about first, because it's the argument that is sustained throughout the presentation I share with you today. The deficit lens we build around EAL learners is not simply contained to that particular population of EALs. Any student who is studying, writing, speaking in what I'll call the legitimized language of an institution, the variety treated as so-called neutral, correct, or academic, the unmarked default language. And here I use English because of my own context, but we can say that about any language that we, quote, legitimize and is measured against a so-called standard and therefore found lacking. I'm borrowing, of course, the term legitimized from French theorist Pierre Bourdieu's idea of legitimate language. The variety of society's institutions quietly agree to treat as the only real, quote, proper, even though that agreement is simply social, historical, and certainly not natural, as it is generally treated, because language, like race, is socially constructed. Think about those whose lives live inside that mechanism. A Black English speaker whose syntax is treated as an error rather than a rule-governed system. The argument that it happens to be at the center of a famous theorist, April Baker Bell's work, a first-generation college student who has never been taught the understated conventions of academic register and who is quietly read or seen as less prepared rather than less familiar with these conventions, a student from a rural or regional dialect whose vowels are treated as evidence of their intelligence or lack of, quote, lack of, a returning adult learner, an indigenous learner with a different knowledge systems, a student for whom English is the language, but not yet the register, not yet the genre of the academic institutions they find themselves in. The mechanism is very identical in every case. One way of using language gets taught invisibly as the norm, and everyone measured against it is positioned as deficient, lacking, often without anyone naming it as language issue at all. It gets called readiness, it gets called rigor, it gets called professionalism. Rarely does it get called what it actually is, one linguistic variety treated as a price of admission to being taken seriously or being worthy of being heard. That's why I think this is this EAL theme happens to have implications for other students. EL learners are the clearest visible case of this dynamic that structures how we evaluate nearly everyone. I'd like to share with you my lens, how I think about this work. I use translanguaging framework. Before I describe what it does, I want to name the scholars whose thinking underlines it, because their work matters as much as their ideas, and because I want to leave you with these resources to consider. Ofelia Garcia is the scholar most associated with translanguaging as a field-shaping concept. Her work, particularly with scholar Li Wei, reframes what we mean by language, arguing that the boundaries between named languages, such as a speaker of English, a speaker of Spanish, are socially and politically constructed. They're certainly not neurological or linguistically real. A multilingual mind doesn't store separate walled-off systems. It draws on one integrated repertoire and moves through it fluidly depending on the task and audience. In other words, there isn't English-speaking Nela, there isn't Spanish-speaking Nela, there isn't Nela who learned French or Chinese in college or while living in China. There is one Nela who's drawing from this wide linguistic repertoire. Scholars Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa developed their own concept of racial linguistic ideology, the idea that language unfortunately gets evaluated not on its own terms, but through a racialized lens that is decades that that decides in advance who is allowed to quote articulate and whose words will be heard as broken regardless of what they actually say. Scholar April Baker Bell extends this into the specific context of Black English in the United States classrooms. This extends to other historically minoritized populations of learners. She argues for a linguistic justice that treats Black students' language as intact as its an own language, intellectually rich with rules, linguistic rules, and forms and functions rather than a barrier or something to correct. Scholar Li Wei, working alongside Garcia independently, has pushed translanguaging from simply a descriptive term into what he calls a practical theory of language, a design principle for us to inform us and to invite us to think how classrooms should be built and not simply as a description of what multilingual learners are doing. And Richard Ortegui, writing alongside with Garcia and Wallace Reid, gives the framework its linguistic backbone, arguing that named languages like English and Spanish are external socio-political categories, while what exists internally in a speaker's mind is a single unified system, a linguistic and cultural repertoire. And Ingrid Pillar's works at the intersection of multilingualism and social justice much more broadly. It keeps me honest about material stakes, that linguistic diversity intersects directly with aspects beyond our classrooms, access to employment, healthcare, legal protections, again, not simply classroom participation. Rosina Lippy-Green documents how linguistic discrimination functions as one of the last socially acceptable prejudices because, unlike other forms of bias, people defend it openly on the grounds that it's just simply about correctness. And higher education and teacher education programs are at the center of that approach. Shauna Shapiro's work on critical language awareness brings this framework directly into writing classroom English for academic purposes, asking students and teachers together to interrogate where the rules that are following actually come from and whose interests do they tend to serve. Together, these scholars refuse easy stories that a student simply needs to be fixed or that language doesn't matter and language is a tool to be used. What they offer instead is an account of how language, race, power, and ideology move together as a set of tools for teaching and learning inside that reality. You'll see that I've outlined them so you can take a look at them. I want to move us to Ophelia Garcia, because translanguaging in practice does not treat students' language as separate, competing systems, one for home language, or that language interference, that home language interferes with school language. It treats the students' full linguistic and cultural repertoire as an integrated resource for making meaning available all at once. And she puts this in a way that is better than I, and this is why I've chosen to share this with you. Education can be a translanguaging space where teachers and students go between and beyond socially constructed language and education systems, structures, and practices to engage diverse, multiple meaning-making systems. That's the lens. Instead of asking, how do we get students to leave their languages at the door? We ask, how do we build classrooms and teacher education programs that treat crossing between languages as intellectual work itself? I want to offer a brief context of this educational history because it helps explain why deficit framing is so durable and is so prevalent around the world. I'll use the United States as my example. U.S. language policy for much of the 20th century was explicitly assimilationist. Bilingual education, if it existed, where it existed, was framed as a bridge to monolingual proficiency, certainly not as a resource to be sustained. In 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act renamed the relevant federal office the Office of English Language Acquisition. These names themselves treat English language learning acquisition as a goal rather than as a part of a fuller multilingual repertoire. Assessment regimes were built around the idea of standardized monolingual academic gatekeeping. That became the primary lens through which EAL students' so-called intelligence, but more importantly, readiness was measured with often only 1 or 2 years of arriving. None of this happened because teachers were not doing their work. It happened because policy, funding, structures, and preparation all encoded the same assumption that the goal was proficiency in one legitimized variety as quickly as possible, and that anything short of that was a problem to be so-called remediated. Teacher education programs, including the ones that many of us come out of, myself included, inherit that assumption largely intact, even as the scholarship told us something else. And as you can see, the ground is shifting. There is a change. This history is not just history. The ground is shifting underneath us. EAL learners in the United States and teacher education cannot treat this as someone else's struggle. Earlier this year, the Department of Education in the United States dissolved this office, the office that was dedicated specifically to these learners, folding its remaining work to other offices. Funding that historically supported teacher professional development, direct services, and state-level infrastructure for this unique population. And meanwhile, in November, this coming up November, voters in the state of Idaho will actually decide on whether to enshrine English as an official language. We don't have an official language. In fact, our founding fathers warned against that concept and that idea. Yet under the current administration, last year in March, the idea of English-only legislation, English-only movement became quite popular and is being taken up by many who feel that this is an important movement and something that needs to be considered. I want to be careful because I know this is clearly contested political terrain, and of course, reasonable people will disagree about language policy. However, I don't think it's controversial to say these are not policy footnotes that are abstract. They shape the resources that our teacher candidates, will have access to. They shape the legal protection that EAL students can rely on. And they shape the cultural so-called permissions that teachers feel to treat multilingualism as a strength rather than as a problem to be addressed alone. Underneath all this policy is ideology, language ideology, which refers to the beliefs we hold often unconsciously, mostly unconsciously, about what we can count as so-called correct, clear, or articulate language, and about the people who use it. These beliefs seem neutral, feel neutral perhaps, like common sense, but they are not. They are socially constructed and they carry significant and often dangerous consequences. I want to be very direct about something. Every conversation we have about language, a conversation is a conversation about identity. It is not a conversation about structure and rules. That's the single most important reframe in this talk, and I want us to sit with it. When we talk about a student, a learner's grammar, accent, structure, we tend to frame it as a neutral correctness, clarity convention. But framing it this way does very quiet and uneasy work because it allows us to avoid the harder conversations underneath. Flores and Rosa's term racial linguistics, which I mentioned earlier, as an ideology, names what's actually happening. The same linguistic feature gets heard differently depending on who is perceived to be producing it. A construction that may be coded as sophisticated, smart, accessible, interesting in one speaker's mind may become coded as incorrect, defective, broken, and when spoken by another speaker, not because the language has changed, but because the listener's assumption about the speaker's class, gender, race, language, origin. This is what Lippy Green means when she calls linguistic discrimination one of the last socially accepted prejudices in the United States. Most people instantly recognize if you say, I don't like people from that group. We see that as discriminatory. However, we don't see this sentence necessarily in the same way. I can't take somebody seriously who talks like that. I can't take that accent seriously. That kind of speech is said out loud in professional settings, in higher education, without much pushback, because we're taught to believe it's about correctness and not about who is speaking. April Baker's Bell's work continues to make this even more concrete. So when a sentence is marked as wrong, awkward, a discussion post is flagged as unclear, these moments can feel procedural, but they are rarely procedural. For the student on the receiving end, they land as a judgment about who that student is and whether or not they belong. Please, I encourage you, ask any multilingual student what it feels like the first time a teacher told them to fix their English, and you'll rarely hear them describe it as a structure or grammar lesson. You'll hear them describe it as a moment they learned that a central part of them, was not welcome in that space, in that classroom. ELL learners live inside that reality every day, often before a single idea they've expressed has even been evaluated on its own merits. That's why we can't talk our way into better practice by only talking about the rules. We have to say plainly that this is about identity and treat it with that seriousness that it deserves. Let's think about what students are bringing. And I want to turn our attention to that because I don't want my presentation today to leave you with simply the deficit story. Students arrive with genuinely extraordinary resources, and these resources are outlined here. Metalinguistic resources, students navigating more than one language tend to develop explicit conscious understanding of grammar, of register, of audience that monolingual peers often do not develop until much later. They have flexible cross-system problem solving. Moving between language is a cognitive task. It's a practice that it's a practice that is daily for them and transfers how students approach unfamiliar academic tasks, conventions, and practices. They have cultural range. These students carry lived fluency across multiple worlds and ways of knowing, an asset that becomes increasingly valuable in our globally connected world. And translanguaging itself is a resource. Rather than separate systems that interfere with each other, a multilingual repertoire functions as an integrated toolkit for meaning making, drawing on strategically, often without even conscious effort. Of course, none of this is intended to be an idealized counter narrative. EL learners face real significant challenges, but these challenges exist along genuine strengths, and programming and teacher education contexts that only talk about the challenges gives future teachers only half the picture and half the resources to work with, and that half that keeps the deficit frame in place. I'd like us to consider my invitation as special educators. I want to make it concrete. In methods courses and practicum seminars in licensing programs, you shape for pre-service and in-service teachers what would mean what it would mean to move the default question from what is the student missing to what is the student's repertoire and how do we teach toward it. For pre-service teachers, it could mean building translanguaging pedagogy into courses from the beginning instead of treating it as an elective aid. It could mean giving them the actual vocabulary to talk about what we've been discussing, to name what they're noticing in their placements, in their classroom experiences, instead of leaving them to just simply absorb the deficit framing because they were never given an alternative. For in-service teachers, it may mean professional development that goes beyond compliance training, accommodation requirements, and actually engages them in examining their own teaching perspectives, their practices, their evaluation, how they evaluate, their instinctive reactions to unfamiliar accents, to unfamiliar constructions, to other languages. And here's the part I want to underline. If this is really a conversation about identity, then it cannot live in the ESL, ELL, EAL methods course or with faculty who specialize in language. This shift asks every teacher we prepare, the future biology teacher, the future math teacher, the future history teacher, the future counselor, to treat language, power, and identity as core professional competencies and not special concern that belongs to someone in another department. Because whether we admit it or not, language is one of the primary ways we evaluate all of us, no matter what discipline, how we evaluate students in our everyday classrooms. A word problem, a lab report, a classroom discussion, a research paper, reflection essay. Every one of these quietly is a judgment about who the student is. Not only what they know, even when no one in the room would describe it that way. If that's true, then understanding language is critical professional knowledge for all educators, not optimal specialization for some. Why does this matter? Again, this matters because it addresses every teacher we prepare, because it sees language as core professional knowledge, and because it's in every discipline every day. This is also critical because students who bring additional languages are part of what makes genuine diversity in higher education and part of how universities truly become global in dialogue with the world, not apart from it. And it obviously connects with UN Sustainable Development Goals 4 and Goal 10. Goal 4, inclusive and equitable education. Goal 10, reducing inequalities. Both rest on the same premise running through my talk, that the knowledge and identity people already carry is worth building on, not replacing. Any institution that treats multilingual students as a problem to manage works against these goals. Institutions that treat them as resources embodies these principles. So I will close with an invitation that I opened with. I put together a short handout asking you to locate yourself on a spectrum, from deficit-oriented view of EAL learners toward a more asset-oriented one. This is an evaluation. It's not something to complete today, but a genuine starting point for you to reflect, because before we can reorient our programs, before we can revise and revisit, I think we need to have an honest, gentle, without judgment, conversation about where each of us stands. I do this myself, and we shift. It's not a comfortable question. It's not meant to be. Language studies and a search for correctness is an invitation to recognize that so-called standardized language, I use that word deliberate, not standard, is a social construct, not a scientific reality. There is no inherent standard language. There are only socially constructed language varieties, historically wielded to keep rather than to include. Language is not a neutral tool that we pick up and set down. Regardless of the discipline we teach, evaluate, and move our students through the university, we do it through language. It's the medium the work happens in, not an instrument separate from it, which means that every one of us, not only language or writing fields, have a stake in how we understand and enact these standards. I'd like to close with a quote that reminds us of the power of language from scholar Dr. Doreen Martinez of the Mescalero Apache indigenous tribe in the United States, an expert on indigenous knowledge systems. Words create reality and truths. Once a story or spoken word is released in the world, it holds the power to shape existence and truths. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to engaging with you. Please feel free to connect with me, and please look at the handout. I hope you'll find it helpful. Thank you so very much.